Will Spencer had always been the kind of young man who moved through the world with a quiet steadiness, shaped by the impossible combination of Bill's intensity and Katie's compassion. But trauma has a way of cracking even the strongest foundations, and what Will endured with Luna, the violation, the horror of the pregnancy that followed, the agony of its loss, and the shock of her sudden death, became something too vast, too jagged, too monstrous to hold. Even with Elektra by his side, offering unwavering support, the emotional landscape inside him grew darker by the day, as though his own mind had become a battlefield where memory, shame, fury, and fear clashed without pause. He could not decide which memory was worse: the moment his consent vanished, the moment he realized Luna was pregnant, or the moment he learned she was gone forever, taking with her every possible confrontation, explanation, or closure he might have imagined. Beneath the surface of his face, calm when he needed it to be, blank the rest of the time, there lived a storm no one could fully see, and it rewrote the way he walked, spoke, breathed, and existed. At first, it was the small changes that caught Elektra's attention. She had believed trauma followed a slow, predictable arc: sadness, confusion, vulnerability, but Will seemed propelled by an entirely different force, one that oscillated between numb detachment and explosive energy. He became hyper-focused on tasks no one had assigned him, staying awake until dawn sketching meaningless lines on paper, running for hours until his legs shook, or disappearing into isolated corners of the beach house as if he were seeking a hiding place from himself. Elektra noticed how he reacted to sudden noises, how he flinched at certain words, how his gaze sometimes grew unfocused, as though some invisible hand was dragging him backward into a memory he wished he could burn out of existence. She kept telling herself that healing looked different for everyone, that Will simply needed time, but the truth hardened inside her slowly. He was unraveling. Will, for his part, tried to bury his emotions deep beneath layers of forced logic, believing he could outthink the misery engulfing him. He told himself Luna was gone, the pregnancy was over, the nightmare had ended, and therefore he should be fine. But trauma is not governed by reason, and grief does not fade just because the person causing it is no longer alive. Instead, Will found that every attempt to suppress his memories only made them resurface with sharper edges. He had moments when his mind would loop uncontrollably, forcing him to relive sensations he hated, or flash scenes before his eyes with such vivid realism that he questioned whether he was awake or asleep. Some nights, he woke gasping for air, drenched in sweat, unsure of where he was. Other nights, he simply stared up at the ceiling until morning, unable to feel anything except the heaviness in his chest, a suffocating weight that crushed even the impulse to speak. As the weeks passed, Will began drifting into behaviors that alarmed everyone around him. He drove recklessly, pushing the car faster and faster along empty stretches of road, as though speed could outrun memory. He climbed dangerous cliffs with no gear, ignoring the loose rocks under his feet. He wandered alone at night into questionable neighborhoods, daring the world to give him a distraction intense enough to silence the chaos in his mind. When Elektra confronted him, he brushed her off with the kind of cold distance that frightened her more than the risk-taking itself. He told her he was fine, that she was overreacting, but his voice would tremble at the edges, betraying the battle he refused to acknowledge. Elektra realized then that Will wasn't merely avoiding help. He was convinced he didn't deserve it. Bill Spencer, who had always met danger with aggression and control, found himself powerless in the face of his son's torment. Watching Will change like this triggered a fear Bill rarely allowed himself to feel, a fear that cut through the armor he wore as a father and a man. He knew self-destructive behaviors too well, he had lived them. But seeing them reflected in Will, a boy he had once sworn to protect from every dark thing in the world, tore open vulnerabilities Bill had spent years denying. He tried to fix the problem the way he handled everything else, directly, firmly, forcefully, but every attempt pushed Will further away. When he told his son to stop the reckless driving, Will disappeared for an entire night. When he forbade him from climbing the cliffs, Will did it again the next morning. When he insisted Will see a therapist, Will laughed bitterly and said no doctor could undo what had been done. Katie, meanwhile, faced a guilt so excruciating it hollowed her from the inside out. She replayed every choice she had made leading up to Will's trauma, wondering whether she had been too distant, too trusting, too blind. Her instinct as a mother was to reach for him, to wrap him in the safety of her arms, but Will had begun recoiling from touch, turning away when she tried to soothe him. Katie felt as though she were grieving two losses at once, the boy she used to know, and the version of herself who believed she could always protect him. Some nights, she sat outside Will's bedroom door, listening for signs that he was sleeping, breathing, still alive. She worried that one day she would open the door and find the unthinkable, that Will had sunk so deeply into despair that he had decided escape was the only relief left. Electra was the only person Will allowed near him, but even she sensed the limits of his trust. Their relationship, once filled with sweetness, humor, and emerging dreams, had become fraught with tension. She cared for him more deeply than she knew how to express, but loving someone drowning in psychological devastation meant constantly battling the current with him. Electra spent hours reading about PTSD, attending support groups, and meeting therapists to understand how to help Will navigate the maze inside his mind. But no matter how much she learned, nothing prepared her for the moments when Will's emotions broke loose. He would shake uncontrollably, or break into sudden rages that left him breathless, or collapse into numb silence, so complete she feared she might lose him to the void. She had never felt so helpless, yet she refused to give up on him. Will had become the person she could not imagine walking away from. Still, the more she held on, the more Will seemed determined to pull back. In his darkest moments, he believed that he contaminated everything he touched, that Luna's actions, her violation, her lies, her manipulation, were somehow his shame to carry. He told himself he should have stopped her, should have seen the signs, should have been stronger. He imagined people whispering about him, judging him, pitying him, and the disgust he projected onto the world turned viciously inward. The guilt was poisonous, paradoxical, and entirely undeserved, yet it grew roots inside him, convincing him he was beyond saving. He sometimes stared at his reflection for long minutes, trying to recognize the face of the boy he had been before everything changed, and seeing instead someone hollowed out by a tragedy that wasn't his fault but had become his burden. The turning point came quietly, in a moment so ordinary it should not have carried the power to change anything. Will had slipped out of the house again, leaving Electra frantic and Bill furious. Hours later, they found him sitting alone at the edge of the pier, staring at the black water below. His legs dangled over the side, his posture relaxed, but there was something in his eyes, vacant, distant, surrendered, that froze Bill in place. Katie felt her breath catch in her throat. Electra felt tears burn behind her eyes. In that instant, they saw not recklessness but resignation, the silent cry for escape from a pain too heavy to bear. When Bill called his name, Will didn't turn. When Katie whispered for him to come home, he didn't move. When Electra placed a trembling hand on his shoulder, he looked up at her with a sadness so profound it felt like the world itself had dimmed. Electra didn't speak, didn't plead. She simply sat beside him, letting the quiet stretch between them, letting her presence anchor him. And slowly, as though waking from a trance, Will leaned into her, his body shaking with the truth he could no longer suppress. For the first time since the trauma began, he allowed himself to cry, not with anger, not with shame, but with grief so raw it cut through every wall he had built. Bill and Katie watched from a distance, understanding that this moment belonged to Will alone, that healing could not begin until he admitted he was in pain. Electra held him tightly, feeling the magnitude of his suffering, knowing this was not an end but a beginning. In the days that followed, Will finally agreed to seek help, though reluctantly and with the emotional exhaustion of someone who had stopped believing in solutions. Therapy did not fix everything at once. It peeled back layers slowly, painfully, revealing truths he had buried so deep he no longer recognized them. He learned that trauma distorts memory, corrodes identity, and reshapes the nervous system itself. He learned that the nightmares, flashbacks, numbing, impulsivity, and rage were not signs of weakness, but symptoms of a wound that needed care. He learned there was no shame in what had happened to him. The shame belonged to Luna alone, and she was gone, no longer able to manipulate or silence him. For the first time, Will saw a path forward, not free of pain, not easy, but real. Katie remained a constant presence, offering patience she had not realized she possessed. Bill supported him through every appointment, every setback, every difficult conversation, learning to replace control with gentleness. Electra stayed beside Will through the sleepless nights and the emotional breakthroughs, becoming not his rescuer, but his partner in healing. Together they formed a fragile, imperfect, but determined circle of support, each fighting in their own way to bring Will back from the edges he had been standing on for far too long. Slowly, Will's sense of self began to reform. He realized he did not need to outrun his memories. He needed to understand them. He accepted that recovery was not linear, that he would have good days and devastating ones, but that neither defined him entirely. He stopped seeing himself as broken and started seeing himself as surviving. He began to believe, cautiously but sincerely, that his future was not lost. And in that belief, a new version of Will Spencer emerged, not the boy he had been, not the victim Luna tried to make him, but a young man who had faced unimaginable darkness and still reached for the light. But the scar of trauma never disappeared completely. There were still moments when the past surged back with crushing force, and Electra would sit with him until the wave passed. There were still times when Bill felt terrified of saying the wrong thing, when Katie wondered if Will would ever be truly safe again. Yet even in these challenges, there was progress, tiny, fragile, but undeniable. Will no longer sought danger to silence his thoughts. He sought connection. He no longer viewed himself as unworthy of love. He allowed himself to receive it. He no longer stood at the edge of the pier imagining release. He stood there imagining resilience. What remained for Will Spencer was not the end of his trauma, but the beginning of his transformation. His story became a reminder that healing is not the erasure of pain, but the refusal to let pain dictate the rest of one's life. And as he continued forward, step by step, breath by breath, those who loved him realized that the question was no longer whether Will would survive the darkness, but how brightly he would rise beyond it. Finn had always believed himself to be a man who could move forward once a decision had been made, someone who could lock away past wounds and choose forgiveness with the clarity of a surgeon closing an incision. For a time, forgiving Dylan had felt like the first step toward restoring order to his life, a life that had been shattered by grief, confusion, and the suffocating silence left in the wake of Luna's death. Yet forgiveness, even when genuine, has a way of loosening buried truths, stirring the waters beneath one's feet, and awakening the kind of instincts that cannot be ignored. For Finn, it began as a whisper, an unease that tightened in his chest whenever he replayed the timeline of the accident, the decisions made, the reports written, the subtle inconsistencies no one seemed concerned about. He told himself he needed peace, needed to believe the tragedy was nothing more than a tragic twist of fate. But peace refused to settle. Something was wrong, and no amount of forgiveness could erase the feeling that Luna's death had left behind unanswered questions far more dangerous than anyone wanted to admit. The first seed of doubt came in the form of a rumor. It was nothing more than a passing comment from a hospital security guard, someone Finn barely knew, who mentioned, with a casual shrug, that an SUV belonging to Forrester Creations had been flagged for maintenance just days after Luna's accident. Finn dismissed it at first, telling himself that coincidences happen and people misinterpret information all the time. But the detail gnawed at him, lodging itself in the crevices of his thoughts like a pebble in a shoe. Why would a corporate security vehicle be involved in anything remotely close to the site of Luna's crash? Why had no one mentioned it? Why had the entire investigation seemed so neatly wrapped up before Finn had even processed that she was gone? Then, days later, an anonymous message arrived at his phone, a single sentence, and signed, untraceable, offering no explanation, simply stating that Luna's death, was not as accidental as it seemed. Finn felt his breath catch as he read it again and again, his mind racing through memories he had spent months trying to suppress. He thought of Luna's smile, the fragility of her secrets, the guilt she had carried in her final weeks, and the unresolved tension that had simmered beneath everything she touched. He thought of the night of the accident, the chaos, the grief, the odd silence that followed from those who should have asked more questions but didn't. The message was brief, but its implications were an earthquake. Someone knew something. Someone was trying to tell him where to look. Someone wanted the truth unearthed. Finn tried to reason with himself, tried to remember the promise he made to Steffi that they would move forward, let go, and rebuild their life after so much turmoil. But the truth does not fade simply because one wishes it away. Instead, it burns brighter, demanding recognition. And it was this burning that pushed Finn to open files he had previously closed, to revisit crime scene photos that twisted his stomach, to trace timelines that no longer aligned the way they once had. The more he studied, the more he found gaps, small, almost imperceptible inconsistencies that only someone familiar with the details would notice. But they were there, waiting, like breadcrumbs scattered across the floor of a darkened room. Finn realized that he could no longer pretend the official version of events was unquestionable. Something had been obscured. Something had been erased. Investigating Luna's death was not merely an act of justice for Finn, it was a reckoning with himself. He had loved her once, in a way he could never fully articulate, a way that had blurred boundaries and tested his marriage. Her loss had struck him deeper than he dared to say aloud, and guilt had become a silent companion in the months that followed. But beneath the guilt was another emotion, anger. Not at Luna, not at himself, but at whoever had taken away the possibility of redemption, forgiveness, or closure. Finn needed to know what really happened. He owed her that much. He needed the truth, even if it shattered everything else he had rebuilt. But pursuing the truth meant stepping into dangerous territory. The Forrester family, powerful and fiercely protective of its legacy, did not tolerate disruption. Ridge, in particular, had always balanced on a thin line between guardian and authoritarian, and the mention of Luna's name was enough to harden his gaze into warning. Steffi, caught between her loyalty to her family and her desire to preserve her fragile marriage, reacted with growing unease whenever Finn brought up inconsistencies in the case. She had spent months trying to distance herself from the chaos Luna had brought into their lives, chaos that had nearly destroyed their marriage, their stability, and their trust. To her, reopening the investigation meant reopening wounds that were still healing, inviting scrutiny that could fracture the family's reputation and reignite old scandals. She did not want to revisit the past. She wanted it dead and buried, especially if the truth threatened to paint someone close to her in a devastating light. But Finn could not stop. Every instinct he had sharpened through years of medical practice, every sense of pattern, logic, and human behavior, told him something was wrong. He began tracing security logs, tracking vehicle repair records, questioning people who had been on the periphery of the accident but not interviewed thoroughly. Each inquiry added friction to his marriage. Steffi's patience thinned. Ridge's warnings grew sharper. The walls around the Forrester legacy seemed to close in tighter with every step Finn took toward the truth. Yet he refused to stop, knowing that the cost of silence would be far worse than the cost of conflict. Finn's investigation became both an obsession and an escape. At night, when Steffi was asleep, he pored over documents illuminated by the glow of his laptop, piecing together fragments of information like a detective chasing ghosts. He learned that the Forrester SUV had been logged as off route on the night Luna died, its GPS disabled for a portion of the evening. He discovered that the driver assigned to the vehicle had abruptly resigned 2 days after the incident, claiming family reasons but offering no further details. He found receipts for repairs that matched the kind of impact damage that could have come from a collision, damage that had never been reported to authorities. Each new detail sharpened his focus, pulling him deeper into a truth he both feared and needed to uncover. When Finn confronted Steffi with his findings, she reacted not with curiosity, but with alarm. She feared the consequences of exposing the past, consequences that could tear apart their family, their business, and their fragile peace. She argued that Luna's death had been investigated thoroughly, that dredging up conspiracy theories would only hurt everyone involved. But beneath her anger was something else: fear. Finn could see it in the way her hands trembled, in the way her eyes darted away when he pressed her for answers. She knew more than she wanted to admit, or at least suspected more than she was comfortable facing. Ridge's involvement was unmistakable. His protective instincts had been in overdrive since the day Luna died, and his reactions grew more volatile each time Finn asked questions. The tension escalated into a cold war within the house, with Steffi begging him to let it go and Finn refusing to abandon the investigation. Love became overshadowed by mistrust, every conversation turning into a battlefield. Finn felt torn between loyalty to his wife and loyalty to the truth, but he understood that marriage built on silence is no marriage at all. If he bowed to pressure now, he would never forgive himself. He would forever wonder whether he had allowed injustice to flourish because it was easier to comply than to confront. And deep down, Steffi knew this, even if she could not bring herself to say it. The anonymous messages did not stop. Each one pulled Finn further into the labyrinth of clues. Photos of tire tracks near the crash site that did not match Luna's car, timestamps revealing discrepancies in witness statements, names of people who had been seen arguing with Luna days before her death. Slowly, a picture emerged, a picture of someone determined to silence Luna, someone with motive, opportunity, and access to resources powerful enough to manipulate an entire investigation. And lurking in the shadows of that picture was the unmistakable silhouette of the Forrester Empire, the very foundation upon which Steffi had built her life. As Finn closed in on the truth, the danger surrounding him intensified. Files went missing. People he tried to interview suddenly refused to speak. A warning message was left on his car windshield, telling him to stop digging. He recognized the threat, but refused to yield. Every attempt to silence him only proved that he was getting closer. Finn realized the truth was far more explosive than he had imagined, something capable of not only destroying reputations, but exposing crimes that could unravel everything the Forresters had worked to protect. The final piece of evidence came unexpectedly, a grainy security clip sent anonymously, showing the Forrester SUV at the location of Luna's crash minutes before her car veered off the road. The vehicle had stopped briefly, its headlights flashing twice, as if signaling someone. Then it disappeared into the night. A chill rippled through Finn as he watched the clip over and over, knowing this was no coincidence. Luna had not simply lost control of her vehicle. She had been intercepted, or worse, chased. When Finn confronted Ridge, the confrontation erupted like a storm, tearing through the heart of the family. Ridge denied everything, but his fury, his defensiveness, and the way his expression flickered for a split second with something resembling guilt only deepened Finn's suspicions. Steffi, caught between them, cried out for them to stop, but neither man could hear her over the roar of their own convictions. Finn accused Ridge of hiding something. Ridge accused Finn of destroying their family. Steffi accused them both of betrayal, one for burying secrets, the other for digging them up. In the end, Finn walked away with no confession, but he didn't need one anymore. The truth stood before him like a shadow cast across the family he once trusted. Luna's death was not an accident. It was a consequence of power, fear, anger, or something far more sinister. And the people closest to him were either involved or determined to keep the truth buried at any cost. Finn understood then that his journey was no longer about Luna alone. It was about integrity, justice, and the courage to confront darkness even when it comes from those you love. The investigation might destroy his marriage, might fracture alliances, might unleash consequences that no one could predict. But the truth demanded to be uncovered. Luna's story deserved to be told. And Finn, despite the pain, despite the risk, despite the fear, was the only one willing to bring it to light. As he stepped into the night, the wind cold against his skin, Finn felt both the weight of what lay ahead and the strange clarity that comes from choosing a path with no turning back. The truth was coming. And nothing, no warning, no threat, no family name, was going to stop him now.